pass you by. Did you ever? If you ever, then come along. Racing cars, sweet ice cream, follow all your brightest dreams. Oh, oh,
Where's Marjorie and Chris? Weren't they just here?
Yes, they were. Well, where'd they go?
Chris, Marjorie, where are you guys?
We're over here, Miss Jennings.
Well, come over and join us. We're getting ready to start.
We'll be right there.
So today's topic is a good one.
What is it?
What is it?
Let me go get those two.
What do you think it is?
I don't know.
Hey, Chris, can you get this book for me? Sure. Thanks.
There you guys are. What are you doing back here?
Well, we're looking at all these books, and there's so many. Where do you think they get the paper to print them on?
That's easy. They have big manufacturing plants that make the paper.
We know paper comes from trees, but how do they actually do it? Is it hard to make paper?
Let's go join the others, and we'll all talk about it, okay?
What were you guys doing over there? Chris and I were talking about paper. Paper? What about paper? We were talking about the amount of paper it must take to make all these books.
And then Marjorie had a question that we thought one of you could answer. Do any of you know how they make paper?
I know they make paper from trees.
We know that much. But how do they actually make the paper from the trees?
That I don't know. But I do know they just don't chop the trees down. A lot of thought goes into which trees to cut and how many.
And why wouldn't they just chop them down?
Well, they could, but in a few years, we wouldn't have any forests left.
I read that the trees are checked first to make sure they're big enough to be cut. They don't want to cut too many trees down in one area. Remember, there are a lot of animals that live in the forest. Where would they go?
Today, we plant new trees, or seedlings as they're called, within a year after they fell them. Felling is the same as cutting them down, you know.
Is that so we'll never run out of trees or paper?
That's right, Jamie. At the turn of the century, when they were building the railroad, they used a lot of trees, and they didn't really think ahead about replacing them. I guess they just thought that the trees would always be there. Well, eventually, seeds did blow in, and trees did grow, but it took a long time. Today, we plant seedlings as soon as possible. It's a much better way of doing things. Wise management of our forests assures that we'll have a steady supply of trees and paper.
Exactly how long does it take a tree to grow large enough to be cut down?
Well, Marjorie, that depends on the tree. A beech tree, which is a hardwood tree, can mature in about 60 years. Pine trees are the most commonly planted seedling because they do mature the fastest. There's a paper company that had all their trees destroyed on 60,000 acres when the volcano Mount St. Helens erupted in 1987. They went in and planted 18 million seedlings to replace them, but they won't even begin to harvest those trees until the year 2026.
That seems like forever. We'll be in our 40s before they even begin to harvest the trees. After all the trees are cut down, how do they get them to the paper factory?
I guess you've never seen those big trucks on the highways that haul those trees.
No, I haven't. But who invented the first paper anyway?
Well, paper as we know it was invented by a Frenchman in the early 1700s. But before paper was invented, people used all kinds of things for writing materials.
What do you mean?
Well, it's surprising how inventive people can be. The first known writing was done by the cavemen. They discovered that they could communicate with each other by picture writing. So they would scratch their messages into the sand or paint them on the walls of the cave.
What else did they use before paper was invented?
Well, they used papyrus leaves, animal skins, and tree bark. So over the years, people used a lot of different things to write on. And over the years, they tried to come up with ways of making paper before they actually came up with a recipe for paper that worked. The Chinese really invented paper.
Well, I thought you said a Frenchman invented paper.
Well, I did. He invented paper as we know it, but it was the Chinese who actually invented the first paper that could be manufactured and written on.
So, why don't we make paper like that still?
It's a long story. I'll tell you all about it when we get back.
Where are we going?
Well, would you all like to see how they make paper?
You mean we can see how they actually make paper?
That's right.
Marty. He picked up that whole truckload of trees.
Look at all the logs. They must make a lot of paper here.
You have no idea. Try 2 million pounds of paper a day. That's what some of the large paper-making machines can produce. And up until 150 years ago, we were still producing paper by hand.
You mean one piece at a time?
That's right. But now we have machines that do most of the work.
Look at that crane with the log. It looks like it's putting it into that machine. Why?
Before we can begin to make paper, we have to take all the bark off the tree, and that machine is a debarking machine. After the tree is debarked, we'll feed it to a chipper.
A chipper? What's that?
A chipper is a machine that cuts logs into small pieces.
Well, look at all those wood chips. Are those the wood chips that they make paper with?
Yes, they are.
It doesn't seem possible that they can turn these chips into paper, does it?
Maybe that's why it took so long for paper to be invented. Shall we go see how they do it?
Oh my gosh, that's a big machine.
I know you're going to laugh, but they call this a digester. Now, watch as the chips are carried by conveyor belt to the digester, where a mixture of water and chemicals await the chips. Hot steam is let in, and the mixture of chips, water, and chemicals are cooked. After the chemicals are used in that process, they are used again. This alleviates water pollution.
Well, how long does this take?
It depends on the kind of paper the wood is being prepared for and the variety of tree from which it comes. The cooking is what actually separates the fibers. This makes it easier for them to bind it together better later.
What happened to all the chips?
As you can see, the only thing left are sticky wood fibers and a lot of liquid. More water will be added, and then we move the pulp, as it is now called, onto the fourdrinier.
A fourdrinier? What is that?
The fourdrinier is the paper-making machine. Right now, we're at the wet end of the fourdrinier. The wet pulp is moved onto a conveyor belt made of a very fine mesh screen. The belt is in constant motion, shaking forward and sideways.
Is that how they shake all the water out?
That's part of the reason the belt is in constant motion. The other reason is so the tiny fibers can mesh together. Since the pulp is mostly liquid, it flows across the vibrating mesh screen, causing the pulp to interlock as the water is removed. At this stage, the operator can actually control the weight and type of paper the machine will make.
Miss Jennings, I'm curious. Why does the paper still look so wet?
Leaving a little moisture in the paper is important. It keeps the paper from getting brittle.
The paper looks done to me.
Oh, look! They're putting it onto a roll.
They call it calendaring. As the paper comes off the drying rollers, it still has a rough surface, so it is smoothed between the rolls of the calendar to take out any wrinkles, and the fibers of the paper are pressed down, just as those of a shirt are smoothed by ironing.
And look how big the roll is.
As the first paper emerges, it is wound into a loose roll. When rolled, it is lifted from the calendar by the arms of this huge crane and transferred to a rewinding machine. Here, the paper is wound very tightly.
What about recycling? We haven't talked about that.
Great thought, Daniel. We'll talk about that later. Here, sharp cutting wheels trim the edges.
Well, how much paper can this big machine make every day?
I'm glad you asked. The fourdrinier can turn out a ribbon of paper up to 25 feet wide and 500 miles long in one 24-hour day at a speed of nearly 30 miles per hour.
500 miles? That's a lot of paper.
Well, what about the paper for books and magazines? How do they cut that?
Look over there. You'll see some paper that's been cut for just that purpose.
You were going to tell us about recycling. How do they recycle paper?
I'm glad you brought that up, Julia. Recycling is very important. It may be a little work, but think about this. A ton of old paper can save 8 trees.
Miss Jennings, remember when we were in the factory? I'm curious about something. You know that big machine, the Fourdrinier? Why do they call it that?
Yeah, can you tell us more about that?
Well, it was named for the 2 brothers who invented it. Interestingly enough, because of a flaw in their patent, those brothers didn't receive a penny for inventing that machine. They had to settle for the satisfaction of it being named after them.
What about the invention of paper? You were telling us that the Chinese invented the first paper.
The first paper was actually invented by a Chinese man. His name was Cai Lun. The year was 105 BC, and scribes had begun painting on strips of woven cloth. They would roll them into scrolls or trim them into flat sheets and bind them into books. Cai Lun was an official in the emperor's court, and he thought it was wasteful that these scraps were being cut off, so he thought that they needed to be reclaimed. He was imaginative enough to realize that those tiny fibers could be transformed into paper.
Paper? Out of cloth?
That's right. He took the cloth along with the bark of a mulberry tree and certain grasses and put them in a big pot along with some water and let them soak. Later, he pounded the rotting fabric and wood until all the particles were separated. He poured his pulp into a frame that he had built. All the water dripped out, and Cai Lun would dry his pulp. There you have the first paper.
How did they get the name? Paper.
Oh, that's easy. Remember how I was telling you about all the different things people used to write on before paper was invented? Remember I mentioned papyrus leaves? Well, the ancient Egyptians learned that they could make a flat sheet by splitting the stalk of the papyrus plant. The word paper comes from papyrus. One of the drawbacks of using papyrus was that it smelled awful, so it was very difficult to use. Remember how I was telling you about the Frenchman who invented paper as we know it? René de Reaumur, a physicist, was watching the habits of the wasps.
Are you going to tell us that a wasp nest has something to do with making paper?
Have you ever seen a wasp nest? They're very strong. René watched as the wasps chewed on bits of wood that they softened with their saliva to make their paper nests. He then wrote an article about the possibility of making paper out of these wood fibers.
I bet the paper makers were very excited.
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But it took another 100 years before people started making paper in large quantities out of anything except cloth.
That's quite a story, Miss Jennings. What if we run out of trees and we can't make paper anymore?
That's why recycling is so important. And that's why the paper companies have made it their business to manage the forests. Careful thinning and removal of diseased trees actually makes the forests grow faster. Today, we plant more trees than we cut down. This is called working the forest, or reforestation. This management of the forest makes it assured that we will have trees forever.
You mean there are other things you can make from wood besides paper?
That's right. I bet you didn't know that wood bark gives us some waxes that we use for cosmetics. And cellulose from trees makes bicycle helmets, placemats, plastic twine, and floor tiles.
Let's not forget that forests are also sanctuaries for our fish and wildlife.
And that the oxygen given off by the leaves is essential to balance the gases in the atmosphere.
That's why it's so important that we have a working forest to produce the products that we need, and that we have a preserved forest to protect our environment and our wildlife. Wood is a renewable resource.
What do you mean?
Unlike coal or oil, once they're gone, they're gone. With reforestation, we can assure that we'll always have trees and paper.
And don't forget recycling.
That's right, it's very important. I can't imagine a world without paper or trees.
Did you ever wonder